Hello and welcome to the Cryptocurrency News channel. Today we're going to talk about Bitcoin, why I'm not actually selling the USD right now, and what is the real enemy of altcoins when it comes to Bitcoin. So there's a lot of topics I'm going to cover. First of all, I'm not going to sell into USD right now because the halving is coming up. So if I'm going to sell altcoins like XRP, VET, whatever, I'm going to just sell back into Bitcoin because even if the alt market does go up, it'll be because Bitcoin went up as well, and at least I'll get part of the gain. I do realize that there is a CME market gap at 8,500. It may very well retrace because in the future it's usually retraced to the lower gaps. But right now, I'm not willing to make that bet because Bitcoin has been rising lately and there's a lot of momentum, and we're going into the halving. The first time I would actually consider selling back into USD is probably mid-April when we get closer to the halving, because people do tend to buy the rumor and sell the news, depending on where BTC is. Now, for Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin SV, I would definitely sell like after their halvings. At Cash, I think like halves on April 7th. SV, I think halves on April 11th or something. So after that halving, I do expect both Bitcoin SV and Bitcoin Cash um, to actually Bitcoin SV and Bitcoin Cash to actually pump kind of like bleed their profits into Bitcoin, because people are going to want to buy Bitcoin after the halving of those two specific coins. So that's my view on like why I'm not really selling the USD. I think there's like too much potential for not XRP, but BTC to burst another thousand or two at any time, and that will drag the rest of the alt market up. So I'm not willing to lose out by getting into USD, but I'm okay with like getting at least part of that into BTC. So that's why I'm not selling the USD, because I think the general trend is going to be up for the next 2.5 months, despite like a retrace or two every now and then. So that's actually my view of why I shouldn't sell, why I'm not selling the USD right now, and I'm only selling the BTC because BTC is a safeguard, and if I sell them to BTC, even if it keeps going up, at least I get part of those gains. If you believe it's going to be a bear market, you should definitely sell into USD, because then you'll get way more gains if you sell into USD, buy back in and trade, than selling back into BTC. But since I believe it's a bull market for the next couple of months, BTC is the way to go. Now, what is the real enemy of altcoins? Like, I'm going to talk in terms of Bitcoin ratio, because obviously, like, if you're talking in terms of USD ratio, it's essentially like Bitcoin dropping. That's the real enemy of alts if you're talking about USD wise. But I'm going to talk about BTC wise, because there's a lot more analysis in terms of like if you're trading back and forth into Bitcoin and not trading back and forth into alts. I mean, not trading back and forth into USD, which is what I do. Like when I sell, unless there's like a gigantic like parabolic move, which there hasn't been yet for Bitcoin, I'm generally just like selling XRP or VET back into Bitcoin and then buying back in at a lower Bitcoin ratio. So what is the real enemy of alts? It's actually not Bitcoin dropping. When Bitcoin drops, yes, the alt ratio does drop some, but the biggest differences in alt ratios is when Bitcoin actually stagnates. When Bitcoin grows, it's generally good for alts, but when Bitcoin stagnates, that's generally like the worst thing for alts. And the reason's actually fairly simple if you think about it. Altcoins, whether it's like small coins like Casino Coin or large coins like XRP and Ethereum, they generally depend on spikes of volume to actually go up, to actually go up or even hold their price. When Bitcoin stagnates, that's when volume is actually the lowest, and then when it stagnates and volume is low, that's when all the other alts tend to actually bleed into Bitcoin. So if you're an altcoin fan and you're trying to improve your Bitcoin position with altcoins or just make more money eventually in the bull run, you don't want Bitcoin. You don't want to be in altcoins when Bitcoin stagnates, because altcoins essentially depend on volume to basically either pump their price or even maintain their price. And essentially, Bitcoin stagnating is not very good for volume. If you actually look at Casino Coin, like a small example, you can see that like all these pumps coincide with large bursts of volume, and when volume goes down, the price tends to go down. And if you look at like a larger coin like XRP, it's the same. It's practically the same thing. Like if you guys remember the pump last May, where XRP went from 30 cents all the way up to 43 cents and eventually 50 cents, above 50 cents for a while, you can see that there was significantly more volume here than around this area. And same thing for like the slight swell pump, in like September, October, you can see volume gradually increased again. There was a big spike here and there was a small lump here. This would actually look pretty big if you actually did the 1-day chart. And then when volume died back down after swell, as you can see here, the ratio, the price actually died back down. So regardless if it's for big coins or small coins, you basically they depend on volume. And now, right now, we are actually looking at a sudden burst in volume right now. And if it actually starts going back down, I'm going to guess that the price is going to retrace because that's kind of what it always does. And I don't really see it breaking out of the pattern that's been going on for the last 2.5 years. And remember, last May, or last June and May, Bitcoin, XRP was much higher in price than even it is now. And that was like a 3-week pump where the volume stayed high for 3 weeks. If the volume stays high for a couple of weeks here, then XRP will keep pumping. Now, we're actually pretty lucky right now because if you're invested in XRP or altcoins, like most of us are, you're actually fairly lucky because the Bitcoin halving is coming up. So volume should stay fairly high. But if volume doesn't actually repump within a few days or a week, then the price will actually start retracing. I mean, it might have like a double or triple pump, but if the volume doesn't stay high and starts retracing, eventually it will start retracing. There's going to be a lag, but the eventual retrace has been borne out the last 6 or 7 pumps. I don't really expect this one to be any different. I've looked at Galvatron's graphs, and honestly, the ODL volume is still insignificant, and it's going to be a couple of years, I think, before it's actually significant. So this is basically a speculation pump, just like all the others. And because it's a speculation pump like all the others, I do actually expect, I actually do expect that it will actually retrace when volume goes down. Now, the thing about swell is swell actually hit at a really bad time because swell was at a time where Bitcoin was at first retracing and then stagnating. So in general, when Bitcoin actually stagnates, altcoins like XRP generally lose ratio, but swell is like a once a year event that actually we all know pumps Bitcoin ratio, XRP ratio against Bitcoin. But the problem is swell hit at a time when Bitcoin was stagnating. So even though XRP ratio did actually come up, the USD value did not really come up. And once swell was over and the big volume pump was over, then obviously you can see USD value came down and Bitcoin value started dropping as well. I think if swell has actually hit right now, XRP would have pumped probably 50% more because instead of working against the Bitcoin stagnation, you have Bitcoin rising right now. And when you actually have Bitcoin rising right now, along with a swell pump, that would have pumped it a much more. I think you probably could have gotten 60, 70 cent XRP if swell had actually hit at this time instead of back last November. So that being said, if you look at the price just for XRP, and if you look at VET and all the others, aside from the times where they actually had their conferences, which is always pumping, you'll notice the same pattern. When Bitcoin stagnates, that's when they actually lose the biggest BTC ratio. Yes, there is this giant, massive slide in January 2018, but that's that's just a retracement from a parabolic pump. But aside from that, generally when Bitcoin stagnates, that's when they lose the biggest ratio of Bitcoin. If you look at XRP's ratio in 2019, the biggest one of the larger retraces in ratio is basically from January. Well, I mean, this only shows February because I'm looking at the 1-year graph, but basically from January until essentially early mid-May. That was a one-way down, and then there's a sudden pop-up here, but that was generally the biggest retrace in Bitcoin ratio. If you look at the Bitcoin graph, I'm going to spread this out over 1 year as well, because that just makes it easier for me to see. If you look at January, this does stretch back into January, but if you look at from January, basically Bitcoin was pretty stagnant, slightly rising from January until April, but very, very little movement. There was a slight bump in April, but really the semi-parabolic move didn't really start until May. So basically from January until May, Bitcoin was fairly stable. Yes, it did rise and there was this bump in April, but it didn't really start rising until May. So because you see May and June, that's where this gigantic slope is. And if you look at XRP ratio, in May and June, it actually held pretty constant and even suddenly went up from April. So basically when Bitcoin, in the period that Bitcoin was fairly semi-stagnant, XRP was basically just bleeding Bitcoin ratio. And likewise, again, after from June until August, which is from here until basically here, where XRP lost Bitcoin ratio again. If you look at this graph, like Bitcoin actually had some ups and downs, but from June until August, it actually remained, decently high. Like the highs were actually above $11,000 from like June until August. Yes, it did lose a little bit, and that's why the ratio for XRP did the ratio for XRP actually did actually come down a little bit. Or the ratio for XRP basically had this little bump here, but overall it was down during the time that Bitcoin was actually stagnant. Now, when Bitcoin started falling again, XRP ratio actually went up, but that's because of swell. And once again in December, XRP ratios after swell, XRP ratio started decreasing again and stayed very low. Now, I think like around like 2,500, it might have actually bottomed. But the thing is, from December until like mid-January, XRP ratio didn't improve at all, and even into February, and that's because like Bitcoin price didn't really improve at all that time. I mean, Bitcoin price basically stayed fairly low until like January 9th or so. So essentially, you can see from all the graphs, if you actually do comparisons, sometimes there's a little bit of lag, but generally like the worst enemy for altcoins in terms of Bitcoin ratio is actually not Bitcoin retracing. It's actually Bitcoin stagnating, because that takes away volume from the whole market because people aren't excited. And when you take away volume from the whole market, people kind of get nervous and they tend to bleed all their money back into BTC. So if you see Bitcoin stagnating for a long time, that's why you want to sell some of your alts back into BTC. When prices are actually volatile, that's actually when you want your money in alts instead of BTC. So that's the analysis for today. A little choppy, and I think you really have to like look at the graphs a little more to determine like the absolute places to buy Bitcoin and altcoins. But generally, like stagnation is bad for altcoins against Bitcoin, and volatility, especially upwards volatility, is really good for altcoins. So that's the report for today. Let me know what you think, like and subscribe, and hit that bell notifications button. Thank you, and have a nice day.